Thanks for tuning in to Liberación Army Radio. This is episode 4 of our podcast. This episode is scheduled to release on April 14th, 2025. Today we will be talking about Trump's insider trading contrasted to notorious stock traders in the Democratic Party. We'll talk about the students being targeted for their advocacy against ICE and for Palestine. Next, we'll cover the Ahlil Hospital, the Mexican recognition of Palestinian statehood, and the water conflict at the Mexico-US border. Finally, we're going to talk about who the enemies of the left are, but be sure to check out the next episode because this is only part 1.
I have to apologize once again because this podcast is going to be out late, but I did want to put it out later because I wanted to make a last minute addition to the podcast news segment. And this is going to be about Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Kilmar was deported mistakenly and classified as an MS-13 member. The primary reason for this was that he had tattoos and a Chicago Bulls hat. The tattoos themselves were not affiliated with any cartel or any criminal syndicate. He was a green card holder, if I'm understanding correctly, and he's currently in Secot prison in El Salvador, which has been accused of being in violation of international law and has very questionable living quarters for its prisoners. Trump's team has admitted that this was an administrative error. They have explicitly stated that they know that they deported him as a mistake. The Republican dominated Supreme Court ruling came down in favor of returning Kilmar, and ruling that the deportation itself in a 9-0 ruling was illegal. That is a complete sweeping of the Supreme Court. And of course, again, this is a Republican stilted Supreme Court. Trump, of course, is using legal nonsense and the vague language inside of the Supreme Court ruling to say that he does not have to compel Salvador nor Salvadoran President Nayib Bukele to return Kilmar. And Nayib Bukele has refused on the grounds that Kilmar is a, quote, terrorist, unquote. And he basically made the case that he's not going to return Kilmar under any circumstances. These, of course, are uncharted waters. There's only one other major instance of a president openly defying a Supreme Court ruling like this, and this was during the Trail of Tears, where Andrew Jackson basically allowed the Georgia governor to expulse the Cherokee population and force them to walk in a death march. But I have a couple things to say. I've seen a lot of noise on social media basically making the case that because we're in uncharted waters that you should panic and that you should have a meltdown, and people are really being unhelpful about this situation politically. I want to give you some words of wisdom from the global south. First and foremost, nothing moves very quickly in a bureaucratic fascist administration. Nothing moves quickly. I promise you, there is still time for people to organize and contest this. There are two types of organizing that I think people should do, and the first and most important one is organizing labor. If you are not unionized, or if you are a renter and looking to form a renters union, I highly encourage you to get that ball rolling because labor is the primary way that you can bring this country to its knees when it comes to organizing in defiance of a dictatorship. I say this as somebody who has survived an American backed dictatorship in Mexico. Additionally, it's important that you get connected with migrant forward organizations, especially if you are a citizen. You need to find an organization that has traction with other migrants that's engaging in social movements. They may do a variety of direct action methods to approach this situation. Another really big strike that typically comes out of migrants, particularly Latinos, is a day without an immigrant. And right now, with the efforts of the Palestinian Solidarity Movement in the context of Mahmoud Khalil and Rumeysa Ozturk, it would be wise for migrants from all walks of life to coordinate to organize a general strike, another great American boycott against the American economy. Again, labor and direct action. The plans that these organizations have to be kept somewhat secret. So you need to get involved with them before you're not able to get involved with them in the future. Finally, it's important that you keep a cool head. Somebody posted a comment. This is now they're coming for the citizens type of situation, which is true. The Trump administration has openly admitted in their hot mic picked up during the dialogue with Nayib Bukele that citizens who are felons that commit crimes in the United States or those who openly dissent against the Trump administration are going to be deported to the Salvadoran gulag. They can't deport all of us, and they also can't put all of us in prison. So, the more people that there are out on the streets, the more likely that there will be success for any social movement. If you don't know where to get connected, I strongly, strongly encourage you to get involved with any student movements at any university near you that is actively doing any kind of resistance. The most important advice that I always give when it comes to American backed dictatorships is you need to know your neighbor. You need to know who your neighbor is. In a time in which nobody is trustworthy because you never know who's in bed with the American government, it really pays to know who your neighbor is and where they stand politically. And it also helps to share resources and provide each other with mutual aid, care, and support. Keep calm and resist. Back to our regularly scheduled podcast programming. We have to talk about Donald Trump's insider trading. I put a screenshot up here, Ryan. What do you think about that?
Okay, so he's saying this is a great time to buy in all caps.
DJT, as is usual. That's his sign off on Truth Social.
Oh,
Do you know a lot about what insider trading is?
yeah, I know
Okay,
what it
so
is.
for the audience, could you give us like a quick what is insider trading?
It's having the information ahead of time about whether or not a certain stock is going up or down, so you know ahead of time whether or not to pull out your investment or to add into your investment.
Right. And so the reason this is problematic is not only is it illegal, it grants people in the stock market special exceptions, particularly those who are in politics. And a lot of times, the politicians who are doing it have special access to information that the average person doesn't have, which obviously gives them a huge advantage in the stock market. I wouldn't even say it's an advantage. It's like basically they get to design the stock market. So it's like they get to design their outcomes.
I think Trump especially is because of the position of power that he's in, he can create these conditions too. It's like, the day before he decided to announce the tariffs, for example, like he probably moved some of his things around, before he made that announcement.
Yeah, so that's exactly what happened. He announced a couple days ago, and this is kind of hard to keep track of, but the gist of it is that he announced all those tariffs on all of these countries, right? So basically, he announced tariffs on like Mexico, Canada, enemies, friends, foes, doesn't matter. It was a lot of rhetoric. He was just yapping a lot about tariffs and like how he was going to make these countries pay for not supporting his agenda. And he posted this statement on Truth Social, the one that we just read. Immediately after that, he announced that he was not going to be imposing tariffs on any of the countries except for China. So China was the only one that was going to still have tariffs, which obviously made the stock market blow up. And he's quoted as saying immediately after to a couple of his friends that they made billions of dollars. He said this to the press, by the way. He was like, yeah, the other day, like my friends, blah, blah, so, and such and such and so, some random billionaires, they made billions, if not tens of billions of dollars. And there was another thing that happened where basically this one whistleblower account initially people thought was fake because he said that Trump was going to announce a scale back on the tariffs, and people were like, oh, this account's lying because it's not verified by anybody. And then it was true that Trump was actually going to scale them back. He was basically trying to whistleblow on insider trading.
Yeah, I saw this clip of him earlier today where he was like, stocks are doing great. It's probably doing great for him. Everybody else that I've been talking to is seeing their retirement plummet, their 401ks plummet.
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing is that The thing about tariffs and this like stock trading war, and I've said this before to you and various other people on my platform, but basically Trump, he's not pro-America. He does not care if the United States lives or dies. Trump is pro-Trump. He doesn't care about what happens to other American people. He cares about what him and his rich friends get to accomplish, which a lot of the times means that he is going to arrange situations to make his buddies money. And that's basically his only interest. He doesn't care about policy. He doesn't care about what's legal or illegal. He cares about making himself money. And this is not new to politics, but it's also not new to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party also does a variety of insider trading sort of things. And a lot of allegations have been levied, particularly against Nancy Pelosi. Are you familiar with Nancy Pelosi?
Yeah, everybody says her stock profile is the one to follow. If she uninvests or something, you're supposed to uninvest from it too. Pretty much.
Yeah. So the reason that Nancy Pelosi has received a bunch of stock trade, insider trading allegations is because she's a part of a bunch of committees, like a bunch of committees, which, in my opinion, should be illegal. This is like par for the course for politics in the United States. A lot of other countries, especially I would consider ethical countries, they make it impossible for politicians to trade on the stock market because it lends itself to situations like these. Politicians obviously control the laws. They
Hmm.
obviously have a huge amount of influence on the stock trade, and they can absolutely exercise that influence to make themselves a quick buck. No problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And meanwhile, everybody has to pay these tariffs on China, which is awful. I love Taobao. I love Taobao.
No, this mostly affects n- not Trump and his homies.
Yeah, well, Trump's doing great. He's, making money off of these
Yeah,
tariffs.
that's what he wanted.
So that brings me to Mahmoud Khalil, who is being targeted by the state. So we've talked a little bit about him, and there's been a development in his case. Basically, a judge ordered that the deportation of Mahmoud Khalil is legal, and they're basically starting the initial process of deporting him. But his lawyers and various other legal figures that are, sort of involved in this case, they are looking for ways to basically apply for like post case asylum essentially to prevent the actual deportation itself. So there are legal avenues that are being pursued, but I think this case is like especially shocking not because he's advocating for Palestine. I feel like that is kind of like to be expected, but I think what's really interesting is that the United States is essentially beginning to reject these refugee intellectuals. This is like not new to the United States, though. It's just that the way that they're doing it under the Trump administration, like everything else that the Trump administration does, is very public and it's meant to intimidate people.
I know he's Palestinian, so I was like, are they would they deport him to Palestine? It's not
No,
even.
because the American government doesn't recognize Palestine. No, Mahmoud Khalil would be deported to Syria or Algeria. The Syria one, I know that he spent some time there as a youth.
Uh,
But most Palestinian refugees end up in Lebanon, actually, and other neighboring countries. Syria, though, is absolutely war torn right now because of the
mhm.
fall of the government that they just had and of various other problems. But what I think is interesting is that Mahmoud Khalil, he, like Edward Said, is a radical who is going to be later applauded by Columbia University. By the way, Edward Said, we mentioned this in another podcast as well, but he came out of Columbia.
I think you're right. They're trying to set precedent. They're trying to discourage protesters, discourage dissent. Really.
Yeah, they're trying to discourage dissent, but beyond that, I did see a lot of news this week about the Trump administration really struggling to actually economically basically be able to deport migrants. So they're using a lot of scare tactics. They recently had like a government website that they put up to get migrants to self-report that they were undocumented so that the Department of Homeland Security could explicitly target them and deport them. Basically Trump is trying to get people to self-deport and he's trying to use intimidation to do it. And he's targeting, you know, basically everybody from Latin America, but also Palestinian people. And if you're a combination of those things, or if you're advocating for those things and you are in any of those marginalized groups, then you're going to be explicitly targeted for being made an example of, because the Trump administration can't afford to deport all the people that they want to.
And
It's
I was
really
like, that's a lot
expensive.
of people.
It's really expensive also. It
Yeah.
costs so much money. Claudia Sheinbaum had a bunch of planes rerouted because the United States government was trying to deport, and this is why we're seeing this like mass deportations to El Salvador and the Salvadorian gulag, because the Salvadorian prison, he has people who are privately invested in his prison. His
Mm,
prison is a for-profit prison.
I see.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just
It's interesting
completely
business
unhinged.
model.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a business venture for sure.
Yeah.
And that brings me actually to Robert King. Have you heard about Robert King?
I think you mentioned him on your TikTok, right?
Yeah, I mentioned him on my TikTok. So he is a Mexican American. He was raised here in the United States, but obviously his family has of course been visited by the horrors of ICE. And I'm gonna play a quick snippet from the TikToks that Fox has been circulating so that people can hear it. The way these ICE agents are pulling up with masks on, unmarked vehicles, they are pulling up like gang members. They are pulling up like the mafia. You might as well shoot them on sight and have your day in court. He's making the case that if you can't recognize ICE agents as ICE agents, that you should dispose of them through any means necessary because they could be intruders on your property. Of course, Fox News, Christy Nome at the Department of Homeland Security, and the account that she runs, which is Libs of TikTok on X, she's really, really making an example of Robert King. He, of course, in my opinion, this is my opinion. I think migrants have every right to feel this way about ICE. And I think that despite the fact that this is going to be misconstrued as a direct threat on DHS, I do think that this is him saying that like these are strangers and they're coming up to you in plain clothes. They are absolutely they could be. They could absolutely be people who
This is like the perfect opportunity for a weirdo to pretend to be an ICE agent.
right. They could absolutely be somebody who has bad intentions who could
Yeah.
abduct you because ICE is showing up without identification. They're showing up in literal medical masks. And by the way, Robert King is somebody who is struggling with mental illness as a result of homelessness and is also very much on the left, has advocated for Rumeza Ozturk as well as Mahmoud Khalil. He has supported Palestine and Palestinian efforts, which is why I think that they're disproportionately and especially targeting him. I think that migrants have every right to feel this way about ICE. I think that people should be angry. And do I think that this was like the wisest thing to post on the internet? No. No, I obviously don't. But one of my mutuals said this and it really stuck with me. If he looked like Luigi Mangione, would people do this to him? He's very visibly Mexican, by the way.
Hmm. I mean, I think he has a good point.
In the show notes, there is a link to his legal aid GoFundMe. So if you are interested in supporting him and you're interested in, making any videos about him, feel free to share the link or share it on your social media. So that is the news about domestic policy. And now we're going to move into international politics. And of course, I really want to focus on Gaza today. You've probably heard this a few times, and you can tell me if you haven't, but a lot of the times when you hear news about Gaza, you hear about the Israeli attacks on like the last hospital
Hmm.
on Gaza, and it's like always a different hospital. Have you heard that before?
Mm-hmm.
So the reason that this keeps happening, like why does it always seem that the last hospital is under attack, is because Palestinians will wait for a lot of aid to come in and they'll focus their repairs on a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll successfully complete those repairs and it'll be the only operating hospital in all of Gaza. And the Israeli military won't let Palestinians back in to fix other hospitals simultaneously. Sometimes they do, but most of the times they can't.
Mhm.
So that's why you're constantly hearing about the last running hospital being under attack by the IDF. It kind of feels a little bit like a game of cat and mouse. The latest game of cat and mouse is being played by the IDF against Ahlil Hospital. As of today, Al Jazeera is reporting on it and saying that it's being explicitly targeted by the Israeli military. Obviously, like, this is a clear-cut war crime. Like, I'm a student of political science, and this is like a very clear, very, very clear-cut war crime. And the International Court has actually officially declared that Israel is an occupant, an illegal occupier of Palestine. I think it's ramping up its attacks on the indigenous population because they exist as a reminder that they are there as settlers.
That's got to be the reason.
Which brings me into Mexican politics actually kind of neatly. Did you hear the news that Claudia Sheinbaum recognized the Palestinian state?
Yeah.
So it's actually not accurate news. Quds Network reported on it, but it's not accurate, unfortunately. So what did happen is that Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum received the ambassador.
I heard about that.
Ambassador came in to advocate for Palestine and Palestinian statehood. But the reason is because Claudia Sheinbaum actually has always wanted to recognize Palestine. And as of November 10th, 2024, right after being elected, she actually made the case for the Mexican public that the state of Palestine should be recognized. The one thing that is kind of a bummer is that because Mexico is a pacifist nation, they can't call for the dissolution of a state. That's
Mm.
illegal under Mexican law and where international law is concerned. So a lot of people, especially American mainstream media, likes to misconstrue that as Claudia Sheinbaum calling for a two-state solution, but that is not an accurate representation of what she has said. Mexico cannot, as a pacifist nation, call for anything other than the recognition of Palestinian statehood as well as much as the state of Israel is being recognized. But she's never called for a two-state solution. That's never been her explicit words.
Mm. It's interesting. So the ambassador's name is Nadia Rashid, and she also went to Columbia University.
Yeah, a lot of radicals came out of Colombia, and this is why we're seeing a huge attack on and suppression on Colombia and a special targeting. Also, Trump has like a weird past with Colombia. There was like some kind of a negotiation that went sour a while back. So he especially doesn't like Columbia University for its inability to work out some kind of a deal with him in like 20 years ago or something. I don't even know.
Really, this is the second um, Palestinian delegate to Mexico. The first one was in 2011.
Yeah,
Yeah,
with Felipe Calderon, I think.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. But this time, I think the Palestinian ambassador, I think she's a little bit more leftist.
yeah. It seems like it.
So, yeah, I mean, Claudia Sheinbaum has always supported Palestinian statehood, and she's always called for the recognition of the Palestinian state. And I know that Mexico always votes pretty much in favor with Palestine anytime that an international measure comes up at the international court. Mexico's always been that girl when it comes to Palestine. And also, something that didn't make the cut today, but if you're interested in looking it up, Mexico also went to the Latino American conference, kind of like the equivalent of the G20 summit, and called for the United States to remove the sanctions on Cuba as well as the sanctions on Venezuela. That brings me to Claudia Sheinbaum's statements of the past. And I think that these are important to highlight because a lot of actual Nazis like to say that because Claudia Sheinbaum is Jewish, that she could never be pro Palestine. But I want to read you a snippet from her letter, which is Save the World, that is today called Gaza. And she's actually quoting somebody, Alberto Spunsberg, the Argentine poet. He said, "This is what it is all about, saving a world. This single and anguished world that we all inhabit, that belongs to all, and that is today called Gaza."
I want to read the rest of it.
So I posted a link in the show notes. The Mexican publication La Jornada published the article. Go to if you go to the show notes and you click it and you translate the article, you'll be able to read the letter in full. Something else that's interesting about Claudia Sheinbaum is that she comes from a family of communists, and this is in the letter.
Unsurprising.
Yeah, this is actually also in the letter. I'll read the quote to you really quickly here. My paternal grandfather arrived in Mexico around the same time, also exiled from Lithuania for political and racial reasons. He was Jewish and a communist.
I know she's really good about slipping that in there. She's really good about like I mean I think she's like slipped into the government too. Not like communist like outright like she's not like in front of your face, but a lot of the things she does is very communist.
Well, she is a communist, but Morena is very much looking to distance itself from the term communist
Yeah.
because the Red Scare and McCarthyism after the Porro movement in Mexico made it really hard for Mexican people to identify as communist
Hmm.
because it was just very dangerous. They basically don't want to scare people, so they use a coded phrase, which is Mexican humanism. They call it Mexican
Mm.
humanism. Given that Scheinbaum is legacy of communists, she probably has read Marx, which means that she knows that communism is based on Mesoamerican indigenous culture, which, is really like such an homage to the roots of communism, Mexican humanism, calling it Mexican humanism. Mexican, of course, being a word that derives from the Mexica Empire. And so now we have our last topic, the last subject for international topics, which is Colombia. I mentioned Sara Millerey to you.
Hmm.
She is a Colombian trans woman. A couple days ago, Sara Millerey was brutally attacked in Colombia as a result of people who are loosely affiliated with the Colombian cartels. And for context, Colombia used to be very socially progressive before American intervention. And there are explicit connections between the Colombian cartel and American intervention. After American intervention, what we saw was an intentional stratification amongst people as a result of poverty and the destabilization campaign that the United States likes to wage on Latin American countries to ensure that those free market trade resources are available at a premium discount.
Hmm.
This ultimately leads the CIA to instill anti trans sentiment, anti LGBT sentiment, racial sentiment, like classic American racism likes to present itself anywhere that the United States has intervened. This is very common. They do this through Hollywood, actually, and
Hmm.
through embassies all over the world to portray like a white supremacist nuclear family as the pinnacle of success in countries that obviously don't have inhabitants that are white, cisgender. For the last approximately 40 to 50 years as a result of this, we've seen Colombia really take steps back from being a progressive country. And it's very dangerous there for trans people. I would say a place like Afghanistan. Afghanistan and Iraq were very, very advanced politically. Iran, too, actually. They were all moving towards protecting and issuing protections for their LGBTQI plus populations. And I've spoken to people who were living in Iran before American intervention and before the Taliban, ISIS, and all of these like American founded terrorist organizations. These people put up the most violent homophobes, transphobes to culturally sort of lead the population. What results is horrible, horrible hate crimes. These loose cartel affiliates were in the light of day beating her to the point where they broke both of her arms and broke both of her legs and put her in a creek. And whenever anybody would try to come and help her, they would threaten to put them in the same situation. So people just recorded her The video file of her being brutally beaten and killed is viral right now.
Hmm.
There's not really a lot that I can say. Obviously, like, get involved in protests and activism if you are somebody who lives in Mexico and you're listening to this, or if you are in America, anywhere. Massive protests have already erupted, though, in Mexico as well as other parts of Latin America. But like, what, I don't even know what there is to say, to be honest. The American empire, of course, is the biggest proponent of transphobia, of homophobia, of just total destruction and annihilation of the social fabric that keeps people together. Mexico has really changed its topography since it's really halted American intervention in terms of how it treats with trans people.
Yeah, when you showed me that video of those two trans ladies in Mexico, and they were talking about they're older, and they were talking about how in the past, it was a lot harder to be trans in Mexico, and things have changed a lot in the last few years.
They were talking about it in the context of Sara.
Mhm.
They were saying that we're so lucky because Wendy, who, if you don't know, Wendy is a prominent trans woman in Mexico. Some people say that she is the most famous person in Mexico. Basically, she featured on a show that's similar to Big Brother. Wendy Guevara.
Mm.
I thought it was Guevara, but I wasn't sure if it was her real name or if it was a chosen name, the Guevara part, because it would be interesting if it was, if she was a communist. But yeah, Wendy Guevara, she is so funny. The search for her, the first search that pops up when you type in Wendy Mexico trans is Wendy Mexico trans funny. Yeah, she's really funny. She's a delight. But anyway, she was so funny and so beloved on the show that Mexican people really started coming into educating themselves about the trans experience. And people in rural Mexico are really adopting a sort of anti transphobic stance. And this is also partially effort from the government as well as,
Mm.
the recognition of indigenous sovereignty and like all these other social programming that allows people not to be so scarce. So they're not looking for people to blame for their material conditions. I think that also all really helps. But basically, she was on La Casa de los Famosos, which directly translates to English in the House of the Famous People. I don't remember exactly what the drama was, but something happened to her on the show, and all of Mexico basically rioted because some Andrew Tate type made a comment about her. And yeah, it really like woke Mexican people up. And that's what these women were talking about. They were talking about how Wendy really woke up the Mexican public, and basically they're living a completely different life than the trans women of the past, and that they're so lucky that all these women walked so that they could run. And they were saying that they felt terrible for Latinos that were not living under these conditions anymore. And she was saying that she also felt really bad for trans women who had left, who had tried to flee to the United States because of the conditions that Latina trans women were facing currently under the Trump administration, and how Mexican people also have noticed that even the Democrats have pretty much abandoned trans women. That's basically all of our news. Now it's time for us to move into our next segment.
Thanks for tuning in to Liberacion Army Radio. Now we will transition into our general topic for today, which is the enemies of the left. I think for a lot of people, when you think of the enemies of the left, for the first thing that comes to mind are white supremacists. And obviously, there are the obvious white supremacists like Nazis, but there are also less obvious forms of white supremacy like Pat Soch and Nat Soch, which we'll get into, and of course we'll touch on Zionists as well under the category of white supremacists. And we'll take a little bit of a nuanced approach on people who co-opt white supremacy, on people who co-opt white supremacy who don't necessarily identify as white or are perceived as white people. There is a pipeline into the alt-right. We'll talk a little bit about that and how people find themselves on that path, and then we'll end on what to do with all this information. How do we break out of the pipeline, the alt-right pipeline, and how do we break others of the alt-right pipeline as well? But I'll have you take it from here.
First, we're going to talk about white supremacists. And I think a lot of people understand white supremacists as sort of a cut and dry identity, but it's actually a lot more insidious than that. And white supremacy itself is an ideology that every single American person has adapted. What's important to notice about white supremacy is that white supremacy is a cultural product of the United States. It was created in the United States, it has a traceable history. I have actually referenced this in several podcasts. But Cheryl Harris's Whiteness as Property is an academic critical race theory journal which traces the legal history of whiteness and specifically its relationship to property and property ownership. And basically, it delves into what whiteness is in terms of the context of the United States. By the way, I don't know if you know this, but white supremacy and whiteness are intrinsically linked. They were manufactured in the United States, and it actually starts as early as Barbados during the inception of the transatlantic slave trade. The first experimental project of white supremacists was Barbados. Did you know that?
I did not know that. I know Barbados has a history of slavery, or at least like
Yeah.
participating in the slave trade to some degree.
So Barbados actually has the first American plantation, which was in 1406. I think it was a sugar plantation. I don't remember exactly, but it's as early as this time that we start to see the inception of white supremacist ideology. And the reason that white supremacy came to be, there are various social theories. Of course, this is my field, so I am your source. White supremacy as a concept is pretty central to social theory and sociology in general. If you want to know more about this, I will include some sources for information for you to research. White supremacy as an ideology has three conceptual ideological understandings where people trace the root of white supremacy to. The first is an ideological justification for the enslavement of Black people and the genocide of Indigenous people. They had to invent something to justify why they were doing these atrocities to other people that they were living alongside. And in fact, a lot of the early iterations of colonization in the United States collaborated with slaves to continue the genocide of Indigenous people. We can see this as early as Bacon's Rebellion. And basically, it wasn't until oppression of the white working class was so severe that they had to incept white supremacy explicitly. Before, it was kind of implied, it wasn't necessarily formulated, like it wasn't necessarily so explicit. White supremacy is especially unique to the United States, and slavery is unique to the United States because of the function of chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. It's a unique evil, and I want to be very, very clear about that. There is no other enslavement system that comes close to what the American slave system is and was like. What makes it unique is the level of dehumanization and what chattel slavery is. Do you know what the word chattel means?
I mean, it sounds like cattle.
That's a really good syllabic sort of association with it. It's the objectification of human beings and turning them into property. That's what that means. So cattle are, of course, living property. So chattel slavery is it's living property. What we see with the inception of the enslavement of Black people is a justification, an ideological justification for why it's okay for them to exploit their labor in this capacity, to exploit them as human beings in this capacity. The other thing that makes it a unique evil, the narratives that accompany it are heavily centered on reproducing them as a working class. A lot of people don't seem to understand that genocide does not just mean the elimination of, it also, by definition, by the United Nations definition, is a mistreatment of a specific people group at a very in a very extensive way. So this is not genocide in an extermination way. This is actually a genocide in a intentional reproduction sort of way.
Hmm.
And that is why the enslavement of Black people is so unique because first, they separate them from their culture in Africa, right? through the transatlantic slave trade. They distance them, which makes them vulnerable to manipulation. Because can you imagine? We're descendants of migrants ourselves. You come to a country where you don't speak the language. There's also something called the scramble, which is a marketplace where Black people are being sold. They're mixed from one ethnic group into another. So, like, they're from completely different parts of Africa, which makes it very difficult for them to communicate with each other, even. So, they don't speak the language. They don't speak the language of each other, which leaves them explicitly vulnerable to organizing. They're not able to organize any kind of resistance. And on top of that, they're weakened from the actual travel itself because it's such a brutal and violent travel. This is different than all other kinds of enslavement. Most other kinds of enslavement in human history is heavily centered on imperialism, meaning like early conquests of early humans and using slavery to seize territory. And it was never a lifetime commitment. It was a temporary
Mm,
commitment. It was more like serfdom, which is not the same thing as American slavery. It's just very, very different. And
mm.
I want to really, really emphasize that, because without emphasizing that, I think people really don't understand why the invention of race was necessary.
Well, why do you think it was? Why do you think it came up in America? Because obviously, white Americans came from Europe first, but
Right.
this kind of slavery did not exist in Europe. It only came after they started colonizing America.
There's a lot to be said about this and a lot of theories about why it specifically happened to the United States, but this is me speaking less as a sociologist practitioner and more as an academic, more as a student. My observation is that the reason it happened in the United States is because of the way that European working class people were exploited. They were exploited in a way that was extremely dehumanizing. The inception of European police really got its roots around the 1400s. The monarchy itself began a brutalization of the working class that was especially unique. This kind of plight, the damage on poor or working class people, is something that is very traumatizing. All of these systems are being reproduced, right? So the monarchy is exploiting the poor, the serfs in Europe. They leave Europe, they come to the Americas, and not
Mhm,
just the United States, right? To both Americas. This is why we see the enslavement of indigenous Mexican people, and we see thus the genocide also of other Mexican indigenous people, as well as the cessation of the northmost part of Mexico, nearly half of Mexican territory during the Mexico American War. But basically, we see these Europeans looking for a better way of life. So they come to the United States and they justify the exploitation of Black people because of their own pain and their own experience as white working class people that were exploited by the monarchy,
mhm,
right? So it's reproductive. So we see that it's cyclical, that it's a cycle that's reproducing upon Black and Indigenous people during the inception of the Americas.
mm,
They knew that it was wrong, though, and there's actually like documented evidence, and I could really, a podcast is not even enough. Really, you need to take a class about this if you don't know about this. Like, there's documented evidence that white people knew that what they were doing was wrong, and a
mhm,
lot of like psychological studies have been done also, as well as sociological studies in conjunction, that have demonstrated that people explicitly knew that enslaving Black people was wrong, and so they had to come up with a ideological rationale for why they were doing that.
mm,
Because at that time, most other countries had started to figure out that slavery needed to be abolished. And so
mm.
imperial slavery, that was like more domestic, was being abolished elsewhere. And it isn't until the 1800s that the idea of abolition starts getting traction in Europe. This is this is actually why the era of enlightenment is called the era of enlightenment, is because there was a whole debate about whether or not slavery should be abolished in Europe.
Yeah, and definitely we can touch more on this when we get to Zionists too, because that's part of what also happened to Jewish people.
Right.
But before we go there, do you feel like you touched enough on what is whiteness?
I do want to conclude with some thoughts about race as a biology. A lot of people seem to think that race is somehow biological. So there's two theories that are sort of like parallel to each other. One is correct and one is incorrect. One is white supremacy and the other one is a correct anthropological understanding of human life, of human evolution. First of all, whiteness is not a race. Anybody can be white from any culture, from any nation, from
Mm,
any genetic background. Like if we were to say that if you were to pick any place, any continent, there are white people on every single continent. There's no
that is true.
exception. No exception there. So white people can come from any group, from any ethnic group, from any people group.
Mm,
And in fact, what we consider, quote, European features, unquote, they're present in every single ethnic group, like every single ethnic group. There's not an exception there. What we understand as white people is a social construct. This is because whiteness, again, is created. It has a start date. It doesn't have like it's not infinite. It wasn't always there, meaning that like it had to be created. If it wasn't always there, then it had to be created. And in fact, this is most easily demonstrated by the fact that Irish people were not always white. They were not always considered white.
mm,
Jewish people were not always considered white.
mm,
So to be classed as white is political. It's a political and social choice. It's
mm,
not a biological choice. Furthermore, this also sort of bleeds into the creation of blackness and indigenousness and other races, quote unquote. Just because these are not biological realities, though, doesn't mean that they don't have real social impacts, and we'll talk a little bit about that after. But the correct anthropological understanding of human life is that you develop features, phenotypes are developed based on your region and
mm,
over hundreds of years. What we understand as white people, the phenotype of white people, it's not possible to eradicate them. It's not possible to eradicate black people, actually, because hundreds of years and generations. What we'll see is people developing those features over time.
mm.
So it's not possible to
It's like
ethnically.
naturally occurring
Right, it's
layers.
naturally occurring. That doesn't mean that, again, these social constructs don't have serious impacts and very real material outcomes for people. But I just want to clarify that because treating race as biological is something that happens accidentally all the time. And in reality, race is a political and a social construct. And there are many different ideologies and many different theories for why it was created. The principal one is that it was created for the service of justifying the enslavement of Black people and the genocide of Indigenous people
Mm,
explicitly. Before that, race did not exist as a concept. Different stratifications and ethnic groups did exist, but not race in the context of the United States and how the United States applies race. That has specific legal and documented evidence. Specifically, more importantly, whiteness has a documented history.
it really sounds like before race was used as a stratification, it was mostly class that was used to stratify.
Yes and no. There was still like inklings of ethnic groups, and
Mm,
that's like even more ambiguous than race. It has a lot more sort of it's like basically having a shared culture and language, and that is already very a blurred line. Like, what about a polyglot? Like
mm,
people who speak multiple languages, which is really really common, especially in the earlier centuries. So I mean, yes and no. The stratifications they did exist, but were they ever used as a weapon? No. No, they were not used ever as a weapon in early history. It wasn't until the inception of the United States that these stratifications were used as a weapon against people of color and to justify certain atrocities. And actually, it isn't until the political nature of the civil rights movement where they're able to basically get communist countries to criticize the United States for being non democratic when Black people are finally released from the grips of legal enslavement. That doesn't mean that all of the other ideological components were gone,
mm.
but in and this is hundreds of years later in the 1960s when this happens.
What is the Great White Replacement theory? It sounds like that's what has evolved.
It's kind of always existed,
Mm,
but again, going back to the true anthropological definition, okay, whiteness is not a race. Whiteness is a phenotype.
mm,
Any group can have it. So there's no such thing as like a pure white race. That doesn't exist. That was an invention that was created by Hitler. It's not real. The Great White Replacement theory argues that white people are being replaced, particularly in the United States, by quote trans people. Transgenderism is what they call it, as well as by migrants. And that quote transgenderism is basically this ideology that's being disseminated inside of white groups, the white race, to eradicate them. So basically, they're saying that like the propaganda of wokeism
uh-huh.
is what they call it, um, which is really a dog whistle for trans people, are being used to ensure that white people don't have babies anymore. This is their belief about the white genocide, quote unquote. So that's the great white replacement theory. And they're arguing that people of color are basically going to outbreed them.
Uh-huh.
This is their belief.
So there's a fear around, and this is an irrational fear, like especially with the phenotypic argument, right? There's not going to be a reality where white people suddenly don't exist. It does sound like the fear is more around white
Yes.
supremacy being something that is going to be eradicated or could very possibly be eradicated.
Well,
So
yes
there's
and
a
no. And I do think that there's value in understanding exactly what they mean.
mhm,
I will say this, that the rich white supremacists versus the poor white supremacists, the poor actually do believe in what they're espousing. The poor,
uh-huh,
100%, the uneducated, they don't believe that this is like an unfounded theory. They think that whiteness is real, that there is a pure white race. This is something called the Herrenvolk, which is it's a German word which means the master race, that they are being eradicated. Like that
mm,
the pure genetic whatever, this is being conflated with science. It's eugenics, right? So it's this belief that like genetically there's like a pure white person, but that doesn't exist because pure whiteness doesn't exist. Everybody technically originates from Africa, and your phenotype developed as a result of time. So, but I keep emphasizing this because in case people are hearing this, I really want to make it very clear that
mm,
race as a biology is not real, but a lot of poor people do understand it that way, and that is like the first entryway to thinking of white people as a people who are being genocided, who are experiencing
mhm,
genocide.
mhm,
But the poor do believe this. The rich, the bourgeoisie, the political class, these are all people who know that that is misinformation, but they use it to create stratification to manipulate the masses.
mhm,
So they do it basically in an effort to make sure that people are able to be used for political purposes. This is what we see explicitly with Donald Trump, but more especially I would say that Ronald Reagan was really good at weaponizing this
mhm,
narrative. It also has a lot to do with like the acceptance of popular culture,
mhm.
but yeah, anyway.
How does this show up in modern culture? We have a few more recent examples, more current examples.
So I recently posted a video and it went a little bit viral about Ian Carroll canceled his clothing company. And I've talked about him at length, but Nick Fuentes, I always point to him. He's Mexican, but he fully believes in like white supremacy and the great white replacement theory. And there are actually a lot of influencers who espouse this great white replacement theory version of white supremacy. And of course, they don't necessarily believe in white supremacy in and of itself. They just believe that white people are being replaced, which it's born from white supremacy.
Mm,
And it's a little bit of an evolved theory because it's really connected to the inception of 4chan.
mm,
And honestly, there's something really fucking twisted about it because it's also a maladaptation of things that are actually happening to indigenous people.
I see.
So great white replacement theories are basically theorists are basically saying like, oh, we're experiencing this genocide, like we're being eradicated by people of color, when in reality Mexican people are indigenous to this land and they're being accused of being the people who are diluting the white blood. And the indigenous
Mm.
population of the United States absolutely is actually experiencing a genocide. It's like totally a projection. It's
Oh, I see.
100% a projection.
It's just like the ongoing colonization of
Right,
this place.
right. And Israel does the same thing to Palestinian people.
Oh,
Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
unsurprising, but yes, it is interesting.
Yeah. It's also really convoluted.
Is it the way that Israel does it? Is it also this like obvious?
No. I would say that Israel and the United States are actually not that obvious about it.
Okay.
It is obvious once it comes to the surface, like once people start shouting like Third Reich narratives,
Uh,
and when Israelis go to the Holocaust Museum and they do like Hitler salutes. Like I think that's when it becomes really overt.
mm,
But in reality, I think in most cases, most people don't know that these people are white supremacists because like what the fuck business does an Israeli have being a white supremacist? Like that seems completely counterintuitive. But in reality, they are supremacists. They are a supremacist class of people. And ultimately, before anything else, like something people also have to realize is that white supremacy was invented for the explicit purpose of perpetuating capitalism. Capitalism is quite literally created as a result of the enslavement of Black people. It is the commodification of human life. That is the literal foundation of modern capitalism. The inception of modern capitalism is simultaneous with the inception of the United States. Did you know that?
no, but that makes a lot of sense.
Right?
It's almost like how white supremacy was kind of a convenient excuse to justify. I think capitalism in a lot of the same ways is also an excuse to justify, but to different means.
Right, right. And so, I mean, Zionism, and I've said this to you before, and I think it's helpful to think of white supremacy, Zionism, and capitalism as the same thing. They're economic institutions, and before they're even institutions of race, they're institutions of money. Their whole purpose is to commodify and capture territory as well as resources and exterminate the indigenous population.
Mm,
And this is true for Africa as well in terms of the inception of the American empire. They were also wanting to eradicate the indigenous population of Congo and the indigenous population of what we now know as Western Africa, which is like Nigeria and like various other places where the enslaved class were taken from.
mm,
So I do think it's useful to think about it as an economic institution first, because then it starts to make a lot more sense, especially when people get like seized by it and turned into white supremacists. Because at first I like this seems so obvious, right? Like when we're
mm,
talking about it, but in reality, there are so many ways that people get coerced into the system and that they get coerced into the alt-right pipeline because scarcity is one
mm,
of the key entryways to the alt-right pipeline.
mm,
Like not having an education is a really good way to get put into the alt-right. But anyway, we'll talk a
mm.
little bit more about that later. But I want to talk a little bit more about incels. So, incels, do you know what incel means?
Involuntarily celibate.
Right. Which is obviously a misnomer.
Yeah,
You can't be involuntarily celibate. That's just called not having game.
yeah.
And a lot of them are, so this is how this is connected to the Great White Replacement theory. Involuntary celibacy basically means that incels, in their own mind, are a marginalized class
Mm,
who can't reproduce the white class. They're not
mm,
able to reproduce the white race. And they have a whole like eugenicist chart attached to like superior women for
mm,
breeding,
mm,
as well as superior men for breeding. And they're called Chads and Stacys. And there's like a whole ideology that's attached to that as well, like people who are like sigmas, alphas, etc. That all
uh-huh,
that language, when people are talking about like sigmas, alphas, and omegas,
uh-huh,
that's all explicit for Chan incel white supremacist language.
huh.
And it always becomes memeified and
It's so
always,
interesting that has come into like popular culture, popular language. People
isn't
don't
it?
realize where it came from.
I know, isn't it? And people use it all the time. And it gets commodified and picked up, especially by young people. Like Gen Alpha, they are really, really likely to pick up 4chan language and start using it. And the other thing that got memeified and got commodified was a Pepe meme, which is the meme of
Mm.
that frog.
Yeah.
That's a racist dog whistle for Mexicans.
Mm.
And it's from 4chan. And it's also related to the Great White Replacement theory, kind of loosely, but it is.
Mm.
Yeah, it's very interesting stuff. But
Yeah.
so that is what incels are. I think it's important to distinguish how like they came to be because it really echoes like the past and how the inception of white supremacy in general happened. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about Nazi quote socialism unquote. So I don't know. Did you know that the Nazi Party called themselves like the Nazi Socialist Party?
No.
Yeah. They weren't actually socialists though. They called themselves socialists explicitly with the intention of creating a alt-right pipeline
Okay, I was like, socialists for who?
for white people.
Okay, okay. I was
Only
like, okay,
for the
cool.
Herren Volk, which I think is
It's like
important.
socialism asterisk.
I'm putting these terms aside because I want people to be able to understand what I'm talking about when I talk about things later in this podcast. Because without understanding these things, it won't be helpful if I start talking about the rest of it because it's kind of like convoluted the way that it all gets built up on itself. So yeah, so Nazis were not actually socialists. In fact, the Communist Party of Russia, which back then was called the Soviet Union, as well as other communist entities, successfully fought against the Nazi Party. That was what they did. And so it's important to like make that distinction because communists have historically opposed and successfully taken down fascism. And this goes
Mm.
back to a lot of the podcasts and a lot of the videos that I make on TikTok where I talk about how liberalism and conservatism are often conflated with sort of like democracy and stuff because communism is also conflated with authoritarianism and fascism. And
Mm.
this is how they do it. They talk about like the Nazi Socialist Party, but the Nazis were not actually socialist. And in fact, the communists oppose the Nazi Party. Point being that communists are historically not fascists. Historically, they're against fascism. And they do have sometimes authoritarian features, but the authoritarianism is authoritarianism associated with the working class. They have like a working class dictatorship is what it's called.
Mm.
This means that like the poor get to dictate what happens. So it's not like a true dictatorship in that like the power is not concentrated in one individual. And it's a huge threat to American and Western style liberal democracy because it completely deprioritizes the capitalist
Mm.
and the racist, the white supremacist, and
Mm.
like the individual. So that's why it's painted that way. But in any case, communism opposes Nazis. And even though they call themselves socialists, they're only socialists in name to like attract leftists.
Did it work, you think?
Yeah, absolutely. They were able to get some Jewish people to work with them. Theodor Herzl worked with them. The Zionism, like
Mm.
Zionism, was the brainchild of Jewish people as well as Nazis.
Mm.
They are deeply related to each other. There's a
Mm.
history there. But before I talk a little bit about that, I want to talk about Patsoch and Natsoch. These terms mean the same thing. Patsoch means patriotic socialist, and Natsoch means nationalist socialist. These are basically people who are make America great again, quote, socialists, unquote, but they're not actually socialists. They are traditional white supremacists. They're Herrenvolk white supremacists. So they believe in like socialism for white people. They believe in socialism
Mm.
for the white working class to save them from being replaced by people of color. And if you were to look for a patsoch or natsoch, they would especially talk about trans people in like a really rabid transphobic light. And they would also talk about migrants as well as explicit anti-Semitic stuff.
These are the people that are a little bit harder to identify as supremacists too. Like a lot of times, these people on the surface, they're like, they seem pretty with it, but if you dig into their history, you can see that like they're not actually aligned on a lot of things, but they know what to say.
Thank you so much for tuning into Liberación Army Radio. This was episode 4 of our podcast. It was slated to release on April 14th, but it will be releasing on April 15th, 2025. We talked about Kilmar, Abrego, Garcia, the Democratic Party in contrast to Trump and insider trading, students being targeted for their advocacy, Ahlil Hospital, the Mexican recognition of Palestine, and who the enemies of the left are. Just remember, this was part 1 of our general topic. Next week, we'll go over the second half of who the enemies of the left are. Thanks for tuning in.